The untold story of the Cold War. Imagine a world where the biggest wars weren't fought with guns and bombs, but with whispers, secrets, and a fear so deep it touched every home. This was the Cold War, a chilling time when two giant superpowers stood face to face, ready to push a button that could end everything, yet they never truly fired a single shot at each other. It was a silent struggle, a global chess game that shaped our world in ways most people still don't fully understand. This untold story began right after World War II ended. The world was shattered, and two very different ideas about how to run a country emerged as the most powerful. On one side was the United States, championing democracy and capitalism, where people vote for their leaders and businesses are mostly free. On the other side was the Soviet Union, pushing communism, where the government controls everything, trying to make everyone equal. These two ways of thinking were like oil and water. They just couldn't mix, and the tension started to build almost immediately, as detailed in a historical overview by the National Archives in 2021. Right away, Europe became the main stage for this new kind of conflict. The Soviet Army, which had helped beat Nazi Germany, now stayed in the countries it had freed in Eastern Europe. They set up communist governments there, making these nations like a buffer zone, a shield for the Soviet Union. Winston Churchill, the leader of Britain, famously said an Iron Curtain had fallen across Europe, dividing the free West from the communist East. This invisible wall was very real to the people living on both sides, limiting their freedoms and sealing their fates. The United States and its friends saw this as a massive threat. They worried that communism would spread like a disease, infecting more and more countries. To stop this, the U.S. came up with something called the Truman Doctrine in 1947. It promised to help any country trying to resist communism. This wasn't about sending armies everywhere, but about giving money and support. Soon after, the Marshall Plan pumped billions of dollars into rebuilding war-torn Western Europe. This wasn't just kindness. It was a smart move to make these countries strong and happy so they wouldn't turn to communism. A 2023 study published in the Journal of Economic History shows how vital the Marshall Plan was in preventing widespread unrest and potential communist takeovers in Western Europe. One of the first big showdowns happened in Berlin, Germany. Berlin was deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, but it was split into four parts, with the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union each controlling a section. In 1948, the Soviets suddenly blocked all roads, canals, and railways into West Berlin, hoping to starve the Western powers out. It was a scary moment. Would the West fight back with tanks? No. Instead, the US and Britain launched the Berlin airlift. For almost a year, planes flew supplies, food, coal, medicine, into West Berlin around the clock. Every few minutes, a plane would land, unload, and take off. This amazing effort showed the world that the West wouldn't give up, and it shamed the Soviets into lifting the blockade in 1949. This event proved that a new type of war was here. It was a war of showing strength, of outsmarting the enemy, and of winning hearts and minds, rather than just battles. The fear of an actual hot war, a nuclear war, was always in the background. Both sides started building huge numbers of atomic bombs. This led to a scary idea called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It meant if one side launched nuclear weapons, the other side would launch theirs, and both countries, and possibly the world, would be destroyed. This terrifying thought actually kept both sides from starting a full-blown war, as explained in a 2019 report by the Bulletin of the Atomic Science. The Cold War wasn't just fought in Europe. It spread across the whole globe. Asia became another major battleground. After China became communist in 1949 under Mao Zedong, the fear of communism spreading grew even bigger. Then, in 1950, North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea, which was supported by the United States. This kicked off the Korean War, a bloody conflict that lasted 3 years and ended in a stalemate. It was a proxy war, meaning the US and Soviet Union weren't fighting each other directly, but they were supporting different sides in another country's conflict. This pattern would repeat many times. Back home, in both the US and the Soviet Union, the Cold War shaped daily life. In America, There was a period called the Red Scare, where people were very afraid of communists hiding within their own country. Senator Joseph McCarthy led a witch hunt, accusing many innocent people of being communist spies. Careers were ruined, and a lot of fear spread. Kids practiced duck and cover drills in school, imagining what to do if a nuclear bomb hit. Fallout shelters became a common sight, stocked with food and water. This constant anxiety deeply impacted American society and culture throughout the 1950s and 60s, a phenomenon well documented by the Smithsonian Magazine in 2020. The space race became another incredible part of the Cold War. It wasn't just about exploring space. It was about showing the world whose science and technology were better. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked everyone by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into space. This was a huge win for them and a wake-up call for America. The U.S. quickly poured money into science education and technology, leading to the creation of NASA. The race was on. The Soviets sent the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into space in 1961. But America answered back, famously putting the first men on the moon in 1969. This wasn't just a scientific achievement. It was a powerful message to the world about American ingenuity and determination. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. Cuba, a small island nation just off the coast of Florida, had turned communist under Fidel Castro. The Soviet Union secretly started placing nuclear missiles on Cuba, which could easily hit major U.S. cities. When U.S. spy planes discovered the missile sites, President John F. Kennedy demanded their removal and set up a naval blockade around Cuba. For 13 terrifying days, the world held its breath. People genuinely feared that nuclear war was moments away. Secret talks between the U.S. and the Soviet Union eventually led to a deal. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. would promise not to invade Cuba and secretly remove its own missiles from Turkey. This critical moment is extensively analyzed in a 2017 book by the National Security Archive, revealing the complex behind-the-scenes negotiations. Even after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War continued its silent dance of power. Spies became crucial players. Agencies like the CIA for the U.S. and the KGB for the Soviet Union ran secret operations all over the world. They gathered information, tried to influence other countries, and sometimes even helped overthrow governments they didn't like. These spy games were often stranger and more dangerous than any movie plot, involving secret codes, dead drops, and incredible bravery or betrayal. The shadowy world of espionage was a constant, low-level conflict that rarely made headlines but always shaped events. The Vietnam War was another devastating proxy war. From the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s, the U.S. got deeply involved in Vietnam, trying to stop the spread of communism from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. It was a long, brutal war fought in jungles, and it divided America deeply. Many young Americans protested the war, questioning why their country was fighting so far from home. Despite massive resources and loss of life, the U.S. eventually pulled out, and Vietnam was united under communist rule. This war showed the limits of American power and significantly impacted the nation's confidence and foreign policy for years, as detailed in a comprehensive historical account by the U.S. Department of State's Office of the Historian in 2018. As the decades passed, the Cold War changed and evolved. New leaders came to power, and both sides tried different strategies. There were periods of détente, a French word meaning a lessening of tension, where the U.S. and Soviet Union tried to work together on some issues, like arms control. Treaties were signed to limit the number of nuclear weapons, a small step towards easing the constant threat of global destruction. These moments of cooperation showed that even bitter enemies could find common ground when the stakes were so high. However, the competition never truly stopped. The arms race, where both sides kept building more and more powerful weapons, continued. The Soviet Union tried to expand its influence in places like Afghanistan, leading to a long and costly war there in the 1980s. The U.S. supported Afghan fighters against the Soviets, once again turning a local conflict into a Cold War battleground. This war drained Soviet resources and morale, contributing to the problems festering within their own country, according to a 2021 analysis by the Council on Foreign Relations. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was struggling. Its economy was weak, and its people were unhappy with the lack of freedom and basic goods. A new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power in 1985. He understood that his country needed big changes. He introduced two new ideas, glasnost, openness, which meant allowing more freedom of speech and information, and perestroika, restructuring, which aimed to reform the Soviet economy. These ideas were revolutionary for the tightly controlled communist system. These changes sparked hope, but also set off events that Gorbachev couldn't fully control. People in Eastern European countries, who had lived under Soviet rule for decades, started demanding their own freedom. In 1989, a wave of protests swept across Eastern Europe. The most famous moment came in November 1989, when the Berlin Wall, a symbol of the Iron Curtain that had divided the city for almost 30 years, suddenly came down. People from East and West Berlin celebrated together, tearing down chunks of the wall. It was an incredible sight, showing that the power of people wanting freedom was stronger than any wall or army. News reports from the time, widely archived by the BBC, vividly capture the shock and joy of this pivotal moment. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a clear sign that the Cold War was nearing its end. The Iron Curtain was crumbling. Country after country in Eastern Europe broke free from Soviet control and began to embrace democracy. Inside the Soviet Union itself, things were also falling apart. Different parts of the vast country, like Ukraine and the Baltic states, wanted to be independent. In 1991, after a failed attempt by hardliners to overthrow Gorbachev, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, breaking into 15 separate countries. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, and the Russian flag was raised. This moment marked the official end of the Cold War. It wasn't a victory won on a battlefield, but a victory of ideas, of people wanting freedom and a better life. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The constant fear of nuclear annihilation, which had hung over humanity for nearly 50 years, finally began to fade. This end was a surprise to many, happening much faster and more peacefully than most experts had predicted, as noted in a retrospective by the Wilson Center in 2016. The Cold War's end left a complex legacy. While the immediate threat of global nuclear war lessened, new challenges emerged. Many of the countries that gained independence struggled to build new economies and stable governments. The world became more connected but also faced new kinds of conflicts. Yet, the lessons of the Cold War, about the dangers of absolute power, the importance of diplomacy, and the enduring human desire for freedom, remain incredibly important. The untold story of the Cold War isn't just about presidents and missiles. It's about the everyday people who lived under its shadow. It's about families separated by walls, children doing bomb drills, and brave individuals who stood up for what they believed in, often at great risk. It was a time of immense tension, brilliant innovation, and profound change that fundamentally shaped the world we live in today. It shows us how two different ideas, pushed to their limits, can bring the entire planet to the brink, and how, sometimes, the greatest battles are won without a single bullet ever being fired. Understanding this unique period helps us make sense of current global events, reminding us that even the most deeply rooted divisions can, eventually, give way to change and the persistent hope for a more peaceful future. The intricate web of alliances, espionage, and technological leaps forged during those decades continues to influence international relations and global power dynamics, a reality frequently highlighted in contemporary geopolitical analyses, such as those published by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.